Good evening, everyone. The camera is rolling and people in the future are watching, so hi, Mom and Dad. Just thought we would have a little quiz to see what you can remember from last week's lecture. I told you I was going to do this. I forgot to mention. Yeah, so if you weren't here last week, that's fine. You got the handout from last week with just the basic timeline, and I pretty much tried to explain the context of each one of these sermons. But so you don't have all the details that we talked about last week, but I think you'll still understand. And it's not a big deal that you missed last week, except you won't be able to participate in the quiz. So who remembers any of the 4 reasons that I gave for Newman to leave the Anglican Church and become Catholic? Oh boy. Oh, in the back. Yeah, 2 people remember. Shout one out. Reading the Church Fathers. Yeah, that counts. So we talked about his studying the Church Fathers for his writing the development of doctrine, and specifically the Arians, the semi-Arians, and how that reminded him of his present-day Anglican Church. And so we talked about that. That was a good reason. Yes?
The reaction to his track, one of the sermons was track 39.
Track 90. Yeah, you're right. The reaction to his track number 90. Very good. It was such a negative reaction from Anglican bishops and Anglicans and the Oxford leadership that definitely contributed to his converting. Yes?
Loss of confidence in the Anglican Church as the via media.
Yes, loss of confidence.
Branch theory, yeah.
The branch theory is failing. The Anglican Church, he realized, was not the middle way, not the via media. Yep, that's a good reason. There's one specific one that's kind of obscure.
The Jerusalem bishopric.
The Jerusalem bishopric, all right. Thank you. Yeah, we talked about how it was a joint effort of the Anglicans and Lutherans, I believe, to establish a bishop in the Holy Land, which Newman and others in the Oxford movement thought was ludicrous, outrageous, and because it showed that the Anglicans didn't believe that the church was apostolic, or else why would they put another apostle into the Holy Land? So yeah, that's basically it. You guys pretty much got them all. There was also the reason of the Oxford leadership was kind of persecuting the high church Anglicans and replacing them with kind of liberals and low church type people. So that was another contributing factor. All right, next question. Who remembers what his motto was? In Latin, it was cor ad cor loquitur. Yeah, shout it out. Heart speaks to heart. Heart speaks, yes. So let's all ingrain that motto into our heads. Cor ad cor loquitur. Cor ad cor loquitur. Cor ad cor loquitur. Cor ad cor loquitur. Nice, I like it. Don't forget. And then what was his kind of, what do you call it when you die and you put it on your tombstone? Epitaph, yeah, the epitaph. Drawing a blank. Does anyone remember what his epitaph was? I mentioned it near the end. It had a Latin phrase, and then I said what it was in English.
Out of shadows and images into the truth.
Yes, out of shadows and images and into the truth. Out of shadows and images and into the truth. Good. All right, that ends the quiz. So if you're watching at home and that's all you were here for, then you can go browse the rest of YouTube. Okay, getting started with this lecture, it's all about his sermons. And I feel like I need to explain a little bit. Oh, do you have any handouts left over? I forgot to save myself one. I need one. Thanks. Oh, actually, no, there were a bunch of them left. There were a bunch of extras. There should be a bunch of extras. I forgot to put one up here for myself.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
I can look at everybody.
Just to explain this handout, and so that you're not offended by me reading what I've handed you also, because I've noticed that when we read Newman sermons, it's good to be able to follow along with the text in front of you on paper. So I am going to be reading everything on this handout, and this is for you to be able to follow along during the lecture and internalize what I'm saying and what Newman is saying to you better. So I'm not trying to insult your intelligence, but I feel it's a better way to learn with it like this. Okay, that explains that. All right. Tonight we will concentrate solely upon Newman's sermons. He gained his initial fame primarily through his published sermons, but also through his preached sermons, because many, many people came to hear him preach in Oxford. That was the culture of the day, to go hear the best preacher give his discourse on the latest woes of society, and that helped people feel good about themselves and to improve their spiritual growth. Also remember, there was no radio, no television, no internet, so to keep in touch, with the prophets of the time, so to speak, people had to physically go to wherever they were speaking in public. So this is very different than today. We can just sit at home, and through the magic of TV or internet, we can just hear pretty much any speaker, unfortunately sometimes, that we can dig up, search for. Sermons in the 19th century were long theological and practical discourses on a topic or topics of the preacher's choosing. Average length of these sermons range from 15 to 20 minutes. I think Newman's sermons were more like 30 minutes delivered. These may or may not have been in the context of a liturgy. That is to say, not all of them were during a mass. Most were read from a manuscript, especially when the audience was a highly educated group, like at a university. So this might sound rather boring to us today, but Robert Ellison, an English professor at Marshall University today, in a lecture about Victorian-era sermons, which Newman's were, said this, quote, "There is plenty of evidence, however, that these preachers had little trouble keeping the attention of their congregations. Perhaps the most famous statement to that effect was written by Matthew Arnold, a leading poet and critic of Newman's day. Regarding Newman's preaching, Arnold wrote, 'Who could resist the charm of that spiritual apparition, gliding in the dim afternoon light through the aisles of St. Mary's, rising into the pulpit, and then, in the most entrancing of voices, breaking the silence with words and thoughts which were religious music, subtle, sweet, mournful.' Newman's voice was described as musical and sweet, soft and low, but also piercing and thrilling. The only obvious oratorical device Newman used was the long pause, which appeared not to be for effect, but the result of sheer intensity of thought. The more eloquent passages were striking because they seemed to be the involuntary outbursts of a preacher unable to contain himself any longer, and whose sole conscious purpose was to convey the most practical and real messages in as plain and simple a language as possible." Close quote on the Robert Ellison quote. Newman rarely used gestures and mostly kept his eyes fixed on the text in front of him. If we look at Newman's preaching career, we see it divides nicely into two halves, an Anglican period and a Catholic period. So starting with the Anglican period. Sermons 1824 to 1843 was 5 volumes of sermons preached between those years, and Parochial and Plain Sermons was published in 1869. There were 8 volumes of this set of Parochial and Plain, and there were about 25 to 30 sermons per volume. The sermons here republished were written and preached at various periods between the years 1825 and 1843. From R.W. Church's book on the Oxford Movement, written in 1900, quote, the tracts were not the most, okay, the tracts, remember we talked about those 90 tracts that Newman and others published as part of the Oxford Movement. Church is saying that the tracts were not the most powerful instruments in drawing sympathy to the Oxford Movement. Without the sermons, the movement might never have gone on, certainly would never have been what it was. While men were reading and talking about the tracts, they were hearing the sermons. And in the sermons, they heard the living meaning and reason and bearing of the tracts, their ethical affinities, their moral standard. The sermons created a moral atmosphere in which men judged the questions in debate, close quote. So Newman's sermons were a boon to the Oxford Movement, even more so than the tracts. Historian Owen Chadwick describes Newman's sermons as severe. Actually, just these ones in parochial and plain. His sermons sometimes exaggerate. His revulsion at what he saw in churches around him was absolute, his demand excessive, his dogma harsh, says Chadwick. And yet he was always able to be lofty without being pretentious, and to condemn whatever was small or shallow without sounding arrogant, close quote. David Newman, in his book Parting of Friends, writes of Newman's Anglican sermons, quote, it was as if he conceived it his duty to bring all professing Christians to their senses, to undo the harm wrought by generations of evangelical preachers who had profaned the holy mysteries by speaking of them in vulgar and familiar tone. The Christian religion itself can bring comfort to the weary soul, but it also induces a holy fear. This is the recurrent theme of Newman's Anglican sermons, close quote. Oxford University Sermons was published in 1871, and it was a collection of 15 sermons preached between 1826 and 1843 in the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford. However, these were parish sermons, not ones preached to the university. At first, many came to hear these, but, quote, slowly the special gifts came clear to a growing group of sensitive Oxford minds. The man was teaching them about Christian truth in a way they had not heard before, and commanded beauty of prose poetry as a fitting vehicle for his thought. Close quote. That's also from David Newman. The 15 sermons in this book, the first was preached on July 2nd, 1826, and is titled The Philosophical Temper, First Enjoined by the Gospel. In this sermon, Newman argues against the common view of his day, held by Enlightenment thinkers, that revealed religion is hostile to philosophy and science. He concludes with these paragraphs. Such men often regard Christianity as a slavish system, which is prejudicial to the freedom of thought, the aspirations of genius, and the speculations of enterprise. They regard it as an unnatural system, which sets out with supposing that the human mind is out of order, and consequently bends all its efforts to overthrow the constitution of feeling and belief with which man is born, and to make him a being for which nature never intended him. And such men also regard Christianity as a pernicious system, which unfits men for this life by fixing their thoughts on another, and which, wherever consistently acted upon, infallibly leads, as it has often led, to the encouragement of the monastic spirit and the extravagances of fanaticism. Although, going on with this sermon, Newman says, although then Christianity seems to have been the first to give the world a pattern of the true spirit of philosophical investigation, yet as the principles of science are in process of time more fully developed and become more independent of the religious system, there is much danger lest the philosophical school should be found to separate from the Christian church, and at length disown the parent to whom it has been so greatly indebted. And this evil has in measure befallen us that it does not increase. We must look to that early religious training to which there can be no doubt all persons, those in the higher as well as in the poorer classes of the community, should be submitted. So it's kind of a prophetic part to the sermon that he's saying that as science and philosophy separate themselves from religion, it leads to trouble and evil that befalls us, he says. Other sermons in the Oxford set are titled Personal Influence, the Means of Propagating the Truth, Faith and Reason contrasted as Habits of Mind, and the final one in the book is The Theory of Developments in Religious Doctrine. This last one is interesting because Newman begins by preaching about the Blessed Virgin Mary and how she kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. He's preaching as an Anglican, remember, and he says this: "Little is told us in Scripture concerning the Blessed Virgin, but there is one grace of which the evangelists make her the pattern. In a few simple sentences, the pattern of faith. Zechariah questioned the angel's message, but Mary said, 'Behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word.' Thus, St. Mary is our pattern of faith, both in the reception and in the study of divine truth. And thus she symbolizes to us not only the faith of the unlearned, but of the doctors of the church also, who have to investigate and weigh and define, as well as to profess the gospel, to draw the line between truth and heresy, to anticipate or remedy the various aberrations of wrong reason, to combat pride and recklessness with their own arms, and thus to triumph over the sophist and the innovator." If Newman thought of Mary this way as an Anglican, imagine how much more devoted he was to her as a Catholic. Another set of Anglican sermons Newman published was called Sermons on Subjects of the Day. This volume was first published in 1869, and it contains sermons Newman preached for his Littlemore congregation at the Church of St. Mary and St. Nicholas. If you remember, Littlemore was that little village south of Oxford where Newman built a little Anglican church there for the people so they didn't have to hike or ride their horse all the way up into Oxford to go to services. And also Newman retreated there as the trouble in Oxford brewed and he was rejected for his Tract 90. He retreated to Littlemore and established a little college, kind of like a monastery of men who prayed and read and lived together. So these sermons on subjects of the day go back to 1831, but most of them are from 1842 and 43, that time period where Newman was in Littlemore almost all the time at the Newman College. As the title indicates, each one of these sermons has a direct bearing on the occasion of its first preaching. W.J. Copeland wrote in the preface to this book, "It may be interesting to the reader to know that the text, Psalm 104, verse 23, which stands at the head both of the first and the last sermon in this volume, was the text of the author's first sermon in 1824, when he went forth to his work and to his labor, and of his last sermon in 1843, when, quote, the evening was come." The last sermon in this book is one of Newman's most famous ones, Parting of Friends. Parting of Friends was preached in Littlemore's Church of St. Mary and St. Nicholas on September 25th, 1843. This was Newman's last sermon as an Anglican priest. He picked that day because it was the anniversary of the dedication of that church. He had just that month resigned his post as the vicar of St. Mary's, Oxford, and had removed himself from Oxford to reside at Littlemore. Wilfred Ward, one of Newman's first biographers, wrote, quote, "It was the last public scene of the silent tragedy which was being enacted. He told in that sermon clearly for those who understood how he himself had found the church of his birth and of his early affections wanting, how he was torn asunder between the claims of those he must leave behind him and those who would follow him, that he could speak to his friends no more from that pulpit, but could only commit them to God and bid them strive to do his will. His voice broke, so the tradition runs, and his words were interrupted by the sobs of the hearers as he said his last words of farewell." Close quote. The small chapel was full. One eyewitness noted about 140 communicants. Newman gave frocks and bonnets to all the children as a parting gift. In attendance were many of his friends, including fellow Tractarians Dr. Edward Bouverie Pusey, who had donated financially to help him build that very church. One writer, we are not sure who, said, quote, Dr. Pusey, John Brand Morris of Exeter, and some others sobbed aloud, and the sound of their weeping resounded throughout the church, close quote. At the end of the sermon, Newman descended from the pulpit, took off his academic hood, and threw it over the altar rail, which was something he always did, but that day it was a symbolic gesture, if there ever was one. Newman began this sermon by recalling Christ's parting from his disciples in the evening of his mortal life. Jesus was about to suffer more than a man had suffered or ever will suffer, but his grief was tender, affectionate, and social. Newman pointed out that Christ wanted to be in the disciples' company to the end, but it was they who abandoned him, all except Mary and John. Then Newman shifts to talk about the laborers and the harvest, based on the text, all things come of thee, and of thine own have we given thee. He talks about the shifting of the seasons and the passing of generations as time passes. Then Newman remembers Jacob, son of Isaac, who left his mother and father to roam the countryside. And he recalls Hagar, who took her son Ishmael to wander the wilderness of Beersheba. Then Newman talks of Naomi, saying, in a time of distress, she left her country and found friends and made relatives among the enemies of her people. But Naomi returned to the land of Judah with Ruth and left behind Orpah with sorrow and pain. But it was the pain of a wound, not the yearning regret of love. It was the pain we feel when friends disappoint us and fall in our esteem, close quote. Then Newman remembers David and Jonathan, best friends who made a covenant on their parting. And David swore an oath because he loved Jonathan, even as he loved his own soul. Finally, Newman compares his departing to Paul's farewell to each of his churches when he would leave them, never to see them again. Concluding, Newman says that all these partings were but mere memorials or tokens of when Jesus Christ approached the end of his earthly life. He wept over Jerusalem, and Newman said, heavily did he leave, tenderly did he mourn over the country and city which rejected him. Close quote. Then Newman describes the Church of England he is leaving in emotional and prophetic language. Now I will read the sample on your handout marked with the number 1. From the sermon, Parting of Friends, preached in Littlemore. O my mother, whence is this unto thee, that thou hast good things poured upon thee, and canst not keep them, and bearest children, yet darest not own them? Why hast thou not the skill to use their services, nor the heart to rejoice in their love? How is it that whatever is generous in purpose, and tender or deep in devotion, thy flower and thy promise falls from thy bosom and finds no home within thine arms? Who hath put this note upon thee, to have a miscarrying womb and dry breasts, to be strange to thine own flesh, and thine eye cruel towards thy little ones? Thine own offspring, the fruit of thy womb, who love thee and would toil for thee, thou dost gaze upon with fear, as though a portent, or thou dost loathe as an offense. At best thou dost but endure, as if they had no claim but on thy patience, self-possession, and vigilance, to be rid of them as easily as thou mayest. Thou makest them stand all the day idle, as the very condition of thy bearing with them, or thou biddest them be gone, where they will be more welcome, or thou sellest them for naught to the stranger that passes by. And what wilt thou do in the end thereof? You can see how he is feeling very kind of abandoned, rejected, estranged from his own church, the church of which he was a priest. And it really comes out in the emotional lines of comparing it to a mother who has a miscarriage. I can't imagine how he must have felt. But to compare yourself to a miscarrying mother is pretty drastic. So you can feel that sense of emotion of, he's leaving the Anglican Church, and because he feels rejected by it. And then we come to the final 3 paragraphs of the entire sermon, which begins with the number 2 on the handout. And so I also put a little picture of the interior. Actually, I guess it's an artist rendering or an old photograph of the interior of St. Mary and St. Nicholas. And on the left there, that kind of dark blob on the side is the pulpit. And when I was there in 2017, the Newman's pulpit's still there. So I thought that was pretty cool. The very pulpit at which he preached this sermon and many others. And now, my brethren, bless God, praise him and magnify him, and praise him for the things which he hath done unto you in the sight of all that live. It is good to praise God and exalt his name, and honorably to show forth the works of God. Therefore be not slack to praise him. All the works of the Lord are good, and he will give every needful thing in due season, so that a man cannot say, this is worse than that, for in time they shall all be well approved. And therefore praise ye the Lord with the whole heart and mouth, and bless the name of the Lord. Leave off from wrath, and let go displeasure. Flee from evil, and do the thing that is good. Do that which is good, and no evil shall touch you. Go your way, eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart. For God now accepteth your works. Let your garments be always white, and let your head lack no ointment. And, O my brethren, O kind and affectionate hearts, O loving friends, should you know anyone whose lot it has been, by writing or by word of mouth, in some degree to help you thus to act, if he has ever told you what you knew about yourselves, or what you did not know, has read to you your wants or feelings, and comforted you by the very reading, has made you feel that there was a higher life than this daily one, and a brighter world than that you see, or encouraged you, or sobered you, or opened the way to the inquiring, or soothed the perplexed. If what he has said or done has ever made you take interest in him, and feel well inclined toward him, remember such a one in time to come, though you hear him not, and pray for him, that in all things he may know God's will, and at all times he may be ready to fulfill it. So we have Newman speaking in the third person about himself, and just asking in a very eloquent way, very moving way, asking for the congregation's prayers for him as he goes forward into the unknown. He knew he had to become Catholic, but he wasn't sure how it would work out. At this time, I would like to just pause and take any input. If anyone has any comments on this sermon, if anything strikes you in the moment, please go ahead and share if you want. If not, then you can save it for the end if you want. Moving on to the Catholic period of his sermons. Oh, go ahead. What strikes you? Or
Yeah, I'm particularly moved by all of the words that he uses in the descriptions of particularly the physical aspects of the separation. And when you say he was rejected, I almost feel as if that the word more appropriately may be unfulfilled, unseen, unmet.
yes,
That he so yearned for a truth, I assume, I'm going to say that, a truth within his heart that he knew was being placed there, but he had no place with which it was seen, accepted, invited, desired, and therefore, it is, when you describe a mother miscarrying a child, there is a pure death that he's
Yes.
speaking of. And that is that spiritual, emotional, physical death. And it speaks, of course, I have the gift of having heard Father Kevin speak somewhat. He spoke just as much over my head as you are. But it was clear. It was clear of the loss of position, status, friendship. His whole existence was disconnected by taking that stance and feeling he had no other choice but to become to let go of the Anglican Church. Now I have a question, and my question is, I missed last week's talk, and when you talk Oxford, you were talking Oxford University and the intellectual movement. Is that what you're describing or dividing with that?
Yeah, so I don't think anyone watching the video is going to be able to hear what you said, so I'm going to try and summarize it and repeat it, but I'm going to fail miserably. The question at the end for the viewers was about Oxford University, the Oxford movement. And yes, he is a teacher at Oriel College in the Oxford University, and he loved Oxford. He loved everything about it, the people, the culture, learning, sharing ideas, the whole kind of collection of brilliant minds and books and the beautiful architecture. So he was in love with this university and the way it did things, and being a teacher there, he studied there, and then he got elevated to a tutor, and then he got elevated to a fellow, which is kind of, like a professor of high rank. So he was at Oxford. But then there was the Oxford movement, which was named because a couple of the leaders were, Pusey and Newman specifically, were fellows at Oxford University. And when they published these tracts and gained international notoriety, it became known as the Oxford movement, also known as the Tractarians, because of the tracts that they published. So that was basically the end question, which was the simple one to answer. But then the comments that were made were all about what Newman was feeling and why he preached with so many words and the analogies and metaphors he used. And I pointed out the miscarrying woman, and so how that was a death was involved. And so it wasn't just a rejection, but it was what was the word? Unfulfilling. He was unfulfilled in his search for the truth. And yeah, I think that's part of it, that Newman's whole life was a search for the truth, a deeper understanding of truth, and more truths that he could acquire intellectually helped him grow in his faith. And so when he saw the Anglican Church kind of departing from this way of truth, and as he studied more and more the church fathers, he saw where the truth was to be held in its fullness. So it was an unfulfillment of many things, not just friends and job and title, but mostly for the truth. And it was multifaceted, and so it's complex. I think I'm going to move on, and maybe after the end we can talk some more. So very good points. Thank you for that. Pointing out what strikes you. And his descriptions are usually very beautiful like these. It's a good thing to point out. Moving on to the Catholic period, leaving behind the Anglican period of his sermons. At this point in time, we have about a 5-year gap in Newman's sermons. The next set of his sermons is in a published volume called Faith and Prejudice and Other Sermons. It's called this because one of the sermons he titled Prejudice and Faith. And he's preaching against anti-Catholic prejudices. This volume contains 7 of his 1848 sermons, and one from 1870 and one from 1873. Quote, "They were preached at St. Chad's Cathedral, Birmingham, in the spring of 1848, almost at once after Newman's return from Rome as a priest of the Oratory. Thus, they are the first sermons he preached in England after he had left Oxford and the Anglican Communion." Close quote. And that is from the introduction to this volume. I'm not sure who wrote it. I didn't put that in my footnote. Bad me. Quote, again from the introduction. "The first sermon he preached after his conversion was on December 4th, 1846. This was a learning experience for Newman, a new Catholic. The sermon broke a silence of 3 years since the parting of friends, but what a contrast. Newman was in minor orders, studying at the College of Propaganda in Rome, still undecided as to his vocation. College of the Propagation of the Faith, now part of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, in case you're wondering what that College of Propaganda is. A niece of the Countess of Shrewsbury had died suddenly in Rome, and it was insisted that Newman should deliver the funeral oration in the Irish Franciscan Church of St. Isidore. Prince Borghese, the Countess's son-in-law, obtained the necessary permission and would take no refusal. Further, Newman was to make moral points and bring home the need of conversion to the English Protestants who would be present. Quote, "I assure you I did not like it at all," Newman wrote. It's like one of those setups, you know. New priest, new seminarian. Give him the tough job. He did his best, though, preaching outside the altar rails without kata, that white surplice-like garment, without beretta, as the custom required. Newman remarked that, quote, "We all need conversion," close quote, but offense was given to some of those present. He was thought to have shown a lack of tact and understanding of the world. The Pope was said to be displeased and to have remarked that what was needed on such occasions was not aceto but miele, not vinegar but honey. The humiliation was a keen one, and the fact that Newman felt humiliation can only have increased the merit of his humble abandonment to God, a virtue he had long been both preaching and practicing. That's the end of that whole quote. I paraphrase some things, but the Faith and Prejudice sermons show us how entirely he threw himself into the Catholic system. The old mastery is there, the style, the concrete illustrations, the psychological insight, and the use of Holy Scripture, as well as the stress on the moral preparation needed for receiving the truth. It is authentic Newman and entirely Catholic. As an Anglican, he had always read his sermons. Now anxious to avoid all singularity, he conformed to the Catholic custom. The entry in his diary for January 30th, 1848, referring to the first sermon printed in this volume, runs, quote, "Walked into Birmingham and read sermon number 2 at High Mass, then walked back. But in the next 3 sermons, all are headed in the autograph, preached, not read, at St. Chad's." So he had like a style shift, where he more like preached them instead of just read them. Then we have Discourses to Mixed Congregations, a set of 18 sermons Newman preached in 1849. The first of these, titled Salvation of the Hearer, the Motive of the Preacher, was preached on February 2nd at 1849 at the opening of the oratory at the Church of St. Anne in Birmingham, the location of the first house of oratorians in England. Pope Benedict XVI, in his 2010 homily during the beatification of Newman, quoted Newman's sermon titled, "Men, Not Angels, the Priests of the Gospel." The Pope said, quote, "The warmth and humanity underlying Newman's appreciation of the pastoral ministry is beautifully expressed. Quote, Benedict's quoting Newman here. And had angels been your priests, my brethren, they could not have condoled with you, sympathized with you, have had compassion on you, felt tenderly for you, and made allowances for you, as we can. They could not have been your patterns and guides, and have led you on from your old selves into a new life, as they can who come from the midst of you. Close quote. The last sermon in Discourses to Mixed Congregations is from the Feast of the Assumption, 1849. Now remember that this dogma was not infallibly defined until 1950. So we have an interesting insight into the mind of a new Catholic priest as to this dogma about 100 years before it was defined. Newman said, quote, "We receive it on the belief of ages, but viewed in the light of reason, it is the fitness of this termination of her earthly course which so persuasively recommends it to our minds. We feel it ought to be, that it becomes her Lord and Son, thus to provide for one who was so singular and special, both in herself and her relations to him. We find that it is simply in harmony with the substance and main outlines of the doctrine of the Incarnation, and that without it, Catholic teaching would have a character of incompleteness and would disappoint our pious expectations." Close quote. The last volume of sermons we have was published in 1874 and contains exactly what its title indicates: sermons preached on various occasions. 8 of them were sermons preached before the Catholic University of Ireland in 1856 and 1857, being the first year of the opening of that university's church. Also included in it are 2 long sermons divided into 2 parts, each one divided into 2 parts. One entitled "Christ Upon the Waters," and the other is "The Mission of St. Philip Neri." Both of these were preached in 1850. There's also an 1853 sermon titled "Order, the Witness and Instrument of Unity," and an 1866 sermon called "The Pope and the Revolution." But most importantly of all, the 10th sermon in this book, and possibly Newman's most famous of all, the Second Spring. To set the stage for this sermon, the context of the Second Spring, Newman preached it at a high mass on July 13, 1852, in St. Mary's Church, Oscott, which is near Birmingham, in the First Provincial Synod of Westminster. 2 years before this, in 1850, Pope Pius IX set up a Roman Catholic hierarchy of dioceses in England and Wales in a papal bull, Universalis Ecclesiae. This led to an outbreak of anti-Catholic hostility. Mobs participated in no popery processions, windows of Catholic churches were broken, and the Guy Fawkes Nights that year saw the burning of effigies of the Pope, Nicholas Cardinal Wiseman, and the 12 new bishops. For Newman, too, this was a time of personal persecution, because the Achille trial, which I spoke about last week, had just concluded. The First Provincial Synod was convoked by Cardinal Wiseman. It was historic and memorable for 2 reasons. First, it was the crowning day of the new hierarchy in England, the first synod held since the Reformation. And second, it was memorable because of this Second Spring sermon. But this was not the only sermon preached at the synod. Cardinal Wiseman preached at the opening on July 7th, and Dr. Henry Edward Manning, at the time a newly ordained Catholic priest and future cardinal, preached on Sunday, July 11th. There were probably others of note, but the most famous is Newman's sermon. In 1911, Francis Donnelly analyzed this sermon, saying, quote, "The Second Spring is the most definite of sermons. If the time, place, and persons concerned with this sermon were not known, the sermon itself would reveal them." Close quote. Some critics call it triumphalistic or excessive. Donnelly says, quote, "He wings his way with the ease and lightness of a bird. Then suddenly, but not too sharply, he soars aloft, not for a long time, but for a glorious flight while it lasts. Close quote. Let me read you some examples from this famous sermon. And we're back on the handout on the bottom of the front page. We have familiar experience of the order, the constancy, the perpetual renovation of the material world which surrounds us. Frail and transitory as is every part of it, restless and migratory as are its elements, never ceasing as are its changes, still it abides. It is bound together by a law of permanence. It is set up in unity, and though it is ever dying, it is ever coming to life again. Dissolution does but give birth to fresh modes of organization, and one death is the parent of 1,000 lives. Each hour as it comes is but a testimony, how fleeting, yet how secure, how certain is the great whole. It is like an image on the waters, which is ever the same, though the waters ever flow. Change upon change, yet one change cries out to another, like the alternate seraphim, in praise and in glory of their Maker. The sun sinks to rise again. The day is swallowed up in the gloom of the night, to be born out of it, as fresh as if it had never been quenched. Spring passes into summer, and through summer and autumn into winter, only the more surely by its own ultimate return, to triumph over that grave towards which it resolutely hastened from its first hour. We mourn over the blossoms of May, because they are to wither, but we know withal that May is one day to have its revenge upon November, by the revolution of that solemn circle which never stops, which teaches us in our height of hope ever to be sober, and in our depth of desolation never to despair. Thus man and all his works are mortal. They die, and they have no power of renovation. But what is it, my fathers, my brothers, what is it that has happened in England just at this time? Something strange is passing over this land by the very surprise, by the very commotion which it excites. What is it all about? Against what is it directed? What wonder has happened upon earth? What prodigious, what preternatural event is adequate to the burden of so vast an effect? We should judge rightly in our curiosity about a phenomenon like this. It must be a portentous event, and it is. It is an innovation, a miracle, I may say, in the course of human events. The physical world revolves year by year and begins again, but the political order of things does not renew itself, does not return. It continues, but it proceeds. There is no retrogression. This is so well understood by men of the day that with them progress is idolized as another name for good. The past never returns. It is never good. If we are to escape existing ills, it must be by going forward. The past is out of date. The past is dead. As well may the dead live to us, well may the dead profit us, as the past return. This then is the cause of this national transport, this national cry which encompasses us. The past has returned, the dead lives. Thrones are overturned and are never restored. States live and die, and then are matter only for history. Babylon was great, and Tyre, and Egypt, and Nineveh, and shall never be great again. The English church was, and the English church was not, and the English church is once again. This is the portent worthy of a cry. It is the coming in of a second spring. It is a restoration in the moral world, such as that which yearly takes place in the physical. 3 centuries ago in the Catholic Church, that great creation of God's power stood in this land in pride of place. It had the honors of near 1,000 years upon it. It was enthroned on some 20 seas up and down the broad country. It was based in the will of a faithful people. It energized through 10,000 instruments of power and influence, and and it was ennobled by a host of saints and martyrs. The churches, one by one, recounted and rejoiced in the line of glorified intercessors, who were the respective objects of their grateful homage. Canterbury alone numbered perhaps some 16, from St. Augustine to St. Dunstan and St. Elphege, from St. Anselm and St. Thomas down to St. Edmund. Where was there in the whole of Christendom a more glorious hierarchy, mixed up with the civil institutions, with kings and nobles, with the people, found in every village and in every town? It seemed destined to stand so long as England stood, and to outlast, it might be, England's greatness. But still could we be surprised, my fathers and my brothers, if the winter even now should not yet be quite over? Have we any right to take it strange if in this English land the springtime of the church should turn out to be an English spring? An uncertain, anxious time of hope and fear, of joy and suffering, of bright promise and budding hopes, yet withal of keen blasts and cold showers and sudden storms. One thing alone I know, that according to our need, so will be our strength. One thing I am sure of, that the more the enemy rages against us, so much the more will the saints in heaven plead for us. The more fearful are our trials from the world, the more present to us will be our Mother Mary and our good patrons and angel guardians. The more malicious are the devices of men against us, the louder cry of supplication will ascend from the bosom of the whole church to God for us. We shall not be left orphans. We shall have within us the strength of the Paraclete, promised to the church and to every member of it. Newman concludes by invoking memories of his spiritual father, St. Philip Neri, saying, "Bear with me for his sake. If I have spoken too seriously, his sweet smile shall temper it." Newman's last sentence reminds the listeners that St. Philip, quote, "wishes to have a name among you and to be loved by you, and perchance to do you a service here in your own land," close quote. Again, I would welcome any spur-of-the-moment comments, thoughts, or questions on this second spring sermon. I think yes?
Question, is there anyone in Northern Big Ribbon posted in today or
I couldn't hear everything that you were saying, sorry. Can anyone?
in modern day, is anyone in modern day Britain right now, maybe springtime or something in the church?
I'm not sure. That's a tough question. Something to the effect of, is there a modern day springtime happening in the English church? I mean, of course, I'll point to the ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham, which has, it's not as large and well populated as ours here in the United States and Canada, but it has brought some rejuvenation to at least the presbyterate. It's grown the number of priests in England, so I'm not really sure. That's a tough question. But I do like, as an ordinariate member, and hopefully if any of you are familiar with the ordinariate mission, I see a lot of what Newman's saying in this sermon as kind of like, especially in the excerpts I read, kind of prophesy about the ordinariate, because I see the ordinariates as a type of second spring to rejuvenate, to bring new life to the Church Catholic around the world, where it's located, where they are located. So a lot of it resonates with me as an ordinariate priest, and hopefully you too, just something to ponder on. Okay, one more question or comment? Go ahead.
I had a question, I don't know if anybody's thought about this, that I've read a lot of English poets, a lot of English writers at that time.
Anglo-Catholics, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, they were referred like, oh, he's okay because he's not really Catholic, he's an Anglo-Catholic, and I go, I don't understand the difference actually.
She's asking about the difference between Anglo-Catholics and Catholics. And basically, to put it bluntly, is the Anglo-Catholics are not in full communion with the Catholic Church, the Church Universal, the church which Jesus Christ founded. And so, while they may revere Mary and they may respect the Pope and all this stuff, and call themselves Catholics, the real fact of the matter is they're divided. They're not in full communion. So we pray for them to come back, to come into full communion with the Catholic Church, as I and many people did in the early stages of the ordinariate and continue to do to this day. So yeah, they need to admit the truth and come into full communion with the Roman Catholic Church.
It seemed popular that night, every time I was writing there, it was discussing that.
Yes, you're right. In conclusion, in 2014, the Baylor University religion professor Nicholas Wirtz wrote, "One of the chief characteristics that granted Newman such power from the pulpit was not his ability to exegete and exposit a biblical text, but rather his ability to exegete and exposit his audience." So exegete refers to exegesis, which is a drawing out of the scripture or drawing out of a text a deeper meaning. And so I like this quote because as a new preacher, we're always trying to do better and better. And Newman inspires us to exegete the audience, so to draw out of the audience something. It doesn't really say, but draw out of them more and more truth or life, so to speak. Newman himself prayed, "O Jesus, make me preach thee without preaching, not by words, but by example and by the catching force, the sympathetic influence of what I do, by my visible resemblance to thy saints, and the evident fullness of the love which my heart bears to thee." Recalling that his motto was cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart, we typically think of this as Newman's heart speaking to God's heart, or God's heart speaking to Newman's. But when we read his sermons, we begin to understand a slightly different interpretation of his motto. Newman wants us to hear his heart speaking to our heart, and by listening to his heart, so profoundly connected to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, that we hear what Newman's heart says to God's heart, and what God's heart wants to say to our hearts.